for him now.
Okay.
Good morning. Welcome to another weekend Veterans for Peace show. My name is David Ross. I'm a graduate of South Burlington High School. I volunteered twice, served 2 tours in the Army as a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam. I saw things that are unimaginable, undescribable. I saw, heroism, but I also saw pain and misery beyond explaining. And everything I've seen, everything I understood from all the history that I've read, war is not the answer to anything.
And I'm Laurie Gagne. I used to be the director of the Edmund Dye Center for Peace and Justice at St. Michael's College, but I retired from there a couple of years ago. But I am still teaching at St. Michael's in the Peace and Justice minor. I teach 2 courses there, the first year seminar in Peace and Justice and Approaches to Peace. And most recently, I spent 30 days in the West Bank. I was with the Meta Peace team, who has had a presence in Palestine for the last 20 years. And I was eager to go because as a professor of peace and justice, I believe I really need to be in the field to know better what I'm talking about with my students. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is something we've been talking about for many years, and I have to say that visiting Palestine really opened my eyes in a new way to what's going on there, and particularly what the Palestinians are experiencing.
I'm John Reuwer. I am a career emergency physician, retired now after 30 years of practice in the emergency department and 10 years in primary and occupational medicine. And for much of that time, my avocation has been peacemaking, trying to figure out why it is people think it's necessary to hurt one another and helping them find other ways to get needs met without doing that. And so that led me into a career understanding nonviolent action as an alternative to doing violence in situations where people feel threatened. And this trip with Meta Peace teams was a way to practice some of the theory that I study. I teach a course on this as an adjunct professor at St. Michael's College and find it very rewarding.
Well, I got lots of questions about that. I'm Dave Ransom, and I served in the Army during the Korean conflict, I guess we call it now. And I'm really eager to hear about these 2 guys and what you found and what you're teaching, what your future is, and what people can latch on to out there. So I'll kick it back to Dave. Are you going to direct us?
Well, I think the first thing we should take a look at is, what was it in your life that started sort of guiding you in the direction of being a peacemaker? Most people are not, at least in terms of an avocation of one type or another. Not like you're different, like there's something strange about you, but what was it that sort of brought you to this work? Was it some personal experience in your life? I mean, for me, it was racism that I saw as a child. It was what I saw in the war in Vietnam. Were there things, events in your life, or things that you read that were like real wake-up calls or spiritual awakening? What was it that got you guys involved in this type of stuff?
Well, for me, I guess I have a personal reason and then a professional reason. The personal reason really has to be my mother, because she was soft-spoken, but she was a very strong peacemaker in our family. She had to be, because my father was a very dynamic individual, very hard-driving and ambitious, and sometimes really difficult to live with, especially if you were his children trying to live up to his expectations. But my mother was the balm over any wounds that might have occurred in our family.
How do you spell that bomb?
So to speak. And I guess we just all kind of inherited that. So that's kind of in our genes. But professionally, I didn't do anything active for peace for a long time. I was always interested in what was going on in the world, but I pursued the field of theology. I have a PhD in Roman Catholic theology from the University of Notre Dame. And I studied mysticism and the spiritual life and was quite happy teaching that for many years until, as a matter of fact, Trinity College closed and I moved across the river to St. Michael's to start teaching peace and justice on a very regular basis there. And eventually I was appointed director of the Peace and Justice Center there. And I sometimes wondered about that transition professionally. Well, wait a minute, I'm teaching peace and justice, which involves politics and history and all that, and I'm really a theologian. But very early on, I realized, no, this is perfect. This is applied theology. And what good is religion and spirituality if you keep it to yourself or among your interpersonal relationships? You have to bring it out into the world. You have to make a difference. So I feel that going to the West Bank and whatever else I've done as an activist in the way of working for peace, we also actually went with the Meta Peace team to the Republican convention a couple of years ago. We thought there might be a lot of conflict and some violence there. And we went with Meta Peace team. As I say, they do a lot of coverage of domestic conflicts. But personally and professionally now, it just seems like exactly, and even spiritually, it seems like where I'm meant to be and where I want to be.
Kind of be the change you look for, be the change you want, manifest what you want in your life and hope that will touch others?
Well, right. And how can you talk about it? And that's what we do in the classroom. We talk about peace. We talk about justice. But at some point, you have to take a stand. And I guess, among other things, going to the West Bank was one way in which I hope to make a difference as a member of this unarmed peacekeeping team. I also wanted, as I said earlier, to really see for myself what's going on there.
So you have become a prophet.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
Here's
but my eyes
troublemaker.
are opened, and I'm eager to share what we saw and what we learned.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah.
For me, I think it's the same motivation that I had for going into medicine. I was just blessed/cursed with a certain kind of compassion that I don't like to see people suffer if it looks unnecessary to me. So medicine was a way to help suffering people, but seeing people intentionally do things to hurt one another seemed counterproductive and unnecessary to me also. And so this avocation during my career of trying to figure out what motivated people to think they needed to hurt each other and what the alternatives were has just become a fascinating field of study for me. My first foray into it was in the World Hunger. Just went to a retreat weekend in college. And after working for several years with a group called Bread for the World, I realized you can change public policy and you can change things to make food more available and less expensive and so forth. And suddenly realized that there was plenty of food in the world, but people were spending most of their money defending themselves from one another. And why were they doing that? And then Ronald Reagan came into the presidency just as I was starting my medical training after medical school, and he was going to win this nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And having grown up with some practice ducking and covering in elementary school,
What
I
a
thought,
horrible way to bring kids up. You know? As if going under your desk would stop anything from hurting you. It was a joke.
But as a doctor, I finally had enough knowledge and a wonderful group to work with called Physicians for Social Responsibility that allowed me to look in exact detail what the medical and physical consequences of using these nuclear weapons would be. And with a little bit of learning and a lot of talks and activism, we turned Ronald Reagan from a nuclear warmonger into one of the greatest nuclear disarmament advocates in our country's history. And we did a good job of reducing the number of nuclear weapons, but we've kind of fell asleep for a while, and during the Obama administration now nuclear weapons are being renewed and modernized, and we're spending a lot of money again, and the danger is increasing. So all the more need for nonviolent activism.
It seems so strange other than the fact, as our old friend Will Miller used to say, follow the money. I mean, we've taken a look at what atomic bombs, the little ones, have already done. Now we have intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, called MIRVs, multiple warheads. So each missile actually will have 8 daughter, son missiles, whatever, come out of it and hit 8 different cities. There's enough nuclear stuff totally serviceable, ready to explode now to end human and most other life on the planet. So how do you improve on that? How do you improve on that level of death? I mean, that is Armageddon in the true sense. That's quite possibly the end of humanity. I've often wondered whether we're going to go out with a bang in a nuclear war or go out with a whimper from global warming. You know, it's like, how can we be so talented, so bright, so learned, and yet put people in government who seem to be so ignorant, so uncaring, so greed and money oriented, that all of these things, they're just dismissive of them, like they're non-issues for them. We're going to renew and upgrade our nuclear capability. What's the point?
Yeah, the problem is I think that there are just so many people in our country who really believe that that will make us more secure. And I think that's because our leaders so often just play on our fears and convince us that we need to spend billions and billions more money than we ever have on upgrading our nuclear weapon systems, just because we need that to maintain our place in the world.
Well, there's one thing I completely agree with President Trump on: fake news. Trump is absolutely right about fake news. I'm not coming from his point of view, my point of view. Good example right now, flags at half-mast for John McCain, our hero. I'm not saying he was a villain, but his job in Vietnam was to drop bombs. And we dropped bombs on civilians. There's no getting around it. They were deliberately targeted along with whatever bridges and industry were there. And it all came out in the Cornell Air War Report, which was methodically studied and analyzed. I mean, you know, it was deliberate. And all the stuff, he's always been in favor. Big, strong military. He's always been in favor of send them here, send them there, send them this way. The only good thing that came out of him was he was against torture. And I sometimes wonder if that was because he personally had experienced torture and thought it was that horrible, or because by talking about it, people would know what a strong guy he was to have survived it. I'm not even sure what the man's motivation was, but he was not, as Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Zoroastrians, Christians, would not come under the definition of a good man.
Well, he certainly was a believer in the myth that the more firepower you have, the safer you are, and that in any conflict, the ultimate arbiter is your ability to shoot your way out of any situation. That's certainly the myth that America and a lot of the world believes, and there's really no science behind that. There's nothing saying that's true, and nuclear weapons are the ultimate expression of that. Even if you believe that having this bloated military that can invade any country at will and usually win in the short term, it doesn't explain nuclear weapons. No. The fact that you mentioned MIRVs, a single Soviet sub off the coast of New England or as far away as the North Sea can have those MIRVed missiles here and hit, a single sub can hit every major American city on the East Coast in the next 15 minutes and do us in. I don't see how that.
And we came very close to that during the Cuban crisis because there were American warships, and they found that they were going over some Soviet subs, and they started dropping these depth charges. And the Soviets were down there, and they were not able to communicate with Moscow. So the basic thing was the political officer, who's like the second in command, has nothing to do with running the sub. He's the political guy. He said they had atomic torpedoes. He said, fire the torpedoes. The commanders of all the ships fire the torpedoes. This guy, Vasiliev, I forget his name correctly, but
We need to remember
he was the
that
guy
one.
he was the guy who was in charge of the subgroup, and he said, "No, wait, do not fire." If he had fired, as everyone was pressuring him to, as was his legitimate self-defense right to, it might have been the end of the world. He's one of those heroes you never hear about. And my bottom line, going back to wrap up on fake news, is I'm using McCain just as an example. So much of what we hear, I mean, you don't hear about Israeli terrorists terrorizing the people of Palestine, stealing their land, shooting their children. You hear about the poor Israelis being attacked by these thugs in Palestine, these not Christian, other believers, other colors, and you hear this with all the news around the world. Meanwhile, we're complaining about how the Russians interfered in our elections. How many governments have we overthrown? If we weren't able to engineer overthrowing them at their own ballot boxes, yes, we do that. Then we would create mercenary armies, back it up with paint truckers to go on strike, paying them 3 or 4 times what they made trucking. They're poor. They took it, a lot of cases. And finally, if everything else fails, like Panama, like Grenada, we'll send in our own military force. So by every recognition possible, we, the United States, is a routine matter, a day-to-day matter, a foreign policy. We overthrow governments, and yet we're hypocritical enough to turn around and say, they fooled with a few of our ballots.
Yeah.
Which is unproven, one way or the other. It's still kind of like an open-air question.
So here,
but
Dave,
the media tells you what to believe.
Yeah.
The media gets paid by the corporations. They're part of a sort of dark government that you don't really see. They're paid by the corporations. The corporations want to make their money. They don't want little people in their way with their stupid signs and marches. And so the news basically reports what's going on. Now, when you got 2 parents working, nobody's really raising the kids because they're just trying to not get thrown out of their apartment and put enough food on the table. They don't have time to go out and find all this alternative media, don't have the education to be able to fully understand it if they do find it and read it. I mean, yeah, fake news.
Yeah.
We are just as controlled as any other totalitarian society with regard to what we hear and the slant that's put on it.
Yeah,
So
I think,
Dave, here is Laurie's base of fear that we're confronting today.
And what do we fight back with? This
right,
show?
it's fake, in a way,
This
it's
show?
fake fear. It's fear that's stirred
Fake
up.
fear.
Yeah, it's the fear that's stirred up toward people who are supposed to be terrorists or our enemies and who aren't at all. For example, the Palestinians, the stereotype is of them as terrorists, so anything they do gets to be attacked, deserves to be attacked by Israel. That is kind of the party line in the media. And what I was going to say is that's why it's so important that no matter how busy you are, you have to find, especially with this Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you have to find a good, reliable news source. I mean, we do have NPR. I think it's pretty good. We have Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, her War and
Right.
Peace report. We all should watch that every night.
Right.
And we have individuals who are there, whose listserv you can get on. John and I met some wonderful people who we read several times a week now. Mazen Kumsia is the name of one of them. He's written several books on the subject of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's part of it, and his words are absolutely reliable. Or become a friend on Facebook of someone who's actually in one of the peace teams that are on the ground there now. We're doing that with someone in the International Solidarity Movement, and we get updates very regularly on what is actually happening on clashes and what's going on at the Gaza fence that you can't read about in any kind of objective way if you read it even in the New York Times.
And one of the most underutilized resources available to everyone at no charge is YouTube. Mm-hmm. Pretty much anybody can put anything on there. And I caution people, there's a lot of not very reliable pulp on there, especially when it comes to fixing certain parts of your lawnmower. Because people don't know what they're talking about. But there's also like Bettany Hughes, The History of the World from the perspective of a real historian that has really studied it and gives you the truth, and even includes important women that history's pushed out and what they did. The Library of Alexandria, they don't know it was run by a woman named Hypatia, who in the end was killed in the streets because of her activity. So you can go on YouTube and you can find Jewish young ladies. I can't remember her name, is one I particularly like. And she talks about, she says, I'm talking to you as a Jewish woman about the plight of the Palestinian people. I know this story. And she takes you through, she shows you how certain checkpoints are closed at night, you know, from dusk to dawn, they're closed. And it's the only way to get to the hospital where you can get some care. And this woman is gonna die with a horrible problem delivering a child. And they call in, they say, no, border's closed, told them, you know. And so she sits there until she dies, and then there's no point, and they turn around and they leave. I mean, you know, you'll find a lot of stuff on YouTube that you'll find nowhere else. Take it with a grain of salt. You need to back everything up.
You can also talk to people that have been there recently.
Oh, I think this would be an excellent idea. Would you know such a person or persons?
We do.
So tell us what you experienced. We've sort of all been involved. Now I'd like you guys to get in depth and tell us what was your experience.
And another thing I'd like to reflect on, have you reflect on it, I'm really frustrated here in talking with my Palestinian, Arab friends and my Jewish friends. There's some of them that will talk with each other, and others just totally refuse. Rabbis.
Yeah, the separation is pretty impressive, the cultural separation. And interestingly, this physical barrier that I believe was mostly paid for by the U.S., this wall of separation that Israel built since the Second Intifada, is made to keep people apart, is probably has more to do with that than it does with actual security for Israel. Because if you look at where it is, it's very hard for me to understand how it makes anybody more secure, but it does a great job of dividing people and separating people from some of their own possessions. So there are lots of Palestinians who have never met an Israeli that was not a soldier. Lots. And there are lots of Jews who have never met an Arab that wasn't a servant, an Israeli servant.
Yeah, but there are some hopeful stories that we heard along these lines. We met this wonderful woman, this wonderful Palestinian woman in Hebron who runs a shop in the old souk, and she's actually the director of the Women of Hebron, some Palestinian women who raise funds to help the Palestinian community there by selling their craft items. But she told us that she had been very depressed and heavy-hearted about the whole Israeli-Palestinian situation, especially since the Second Intifada. Before that, especially with the First Intifada, which started back in 1987, which was largely nonviolent. She said we were all unified, we were all together. But since the Second Intifada, which began in 2000, we have become divided. We're really at odds with each other. And she said that plus the fact that Israel is showing such a stern, inhumane face to us just made her depressed. But she said there was a turning point, and it was when some Israelis came and protested with the people of Hebron one time during the Second Intifada, toward the end of the Second Intifada. And she said, or no, it was later than that. This woman is 45 or 50. She's been working hard for her Palestinian people most of her life, and yet she only had this breakthrough, she said, the last 5 or 6 years. I guess it was right around Operation Cast Lead, which would have been 2008 or 2009, that there were some Israelis who came to Hebron and protested the treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza with them. And she said, that gave me hope. She's a very religious person, and she said, I just took that as a gift from God and a sign from God that some Israelis can be trusted. And we didn't see that too often. Well, for one thing, that tells you the depth of the mistrust that John is talking about, the degree of separation between Palestinians and Israelis. And it is something that just gets passed down from generation to generation. This was a deeply devout Muslim woman who knew she was supposed to be a woman of peace, and she couldn't relate to Israelis as anything other than enemies, you know. So this was a great spiritual turning point for her. But I mean, it's just given their social conditioning, that's the situation. And a high point for us along these lines was the very last day when we made it to the Gaza fence ourselves with a group of Israelis who were all ardently Palestinian, and they were leading this demonstration on their side of the fence that was to show support for the people on the other side. And so that was very moving, and I'm just really glad we ended our trip that way, because it just reminded us that, you know, it's people are human beings, and you don't have to categorize them on one side of the divide or the other.
Such a touching thought that you have this huge wall in Israel. And of course, we remember Ronald Reagan talking to Gorbachev, and I've actually...
Right. Tear down the wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now we have President Trump, build the wall.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Right.
And actually, even if it's just a border with a marker, it's still a kind of a wall. And I cannot remember, this is one of the problems with becoming an older person. You don't always remember everything. I can't remember which one of the astronauts. One of the astronauts looked out and he said, I saw the Earth, this one incredible miracle, this blue-green globe with no borders.
That was
You
Neil
could
Armstrong.
See, Neil Armstrong. He said you could see the cities, but you couldn't see the borders. You couldn't see the country. You couldn't see the wars, the political fights. You just saw this incredible miracle just hanging right there in space. And you know you are from that and so far away that for the first time you can actually see it. Oh my gosh, what an epiphany.
This, Dave, I think is why we share our views that war is obsolete, doesn't serve a function anymore, because it absolutely requires those boundaries. You can't have a war without those boundaries, and boundaries are artificial. They separate human beings in ways that I don't think we were made or even evolved to be separated in.
Yeah.
I agree.
That's why it was, I have to say, just really shocking and really difficult for me to see the reality on the West Bank. I certainly have read about it for a long time. Some of you remember our Sister Miriam Ward, who was an ardent supporter
Dear
of the
friend of mine
Palestinians.
for many
Right, great friend of the Palestinians. Well, and we heard from her what was going on, but this was my first trip. This was John's fourth, so he wasn't surprised, but I, despite what I knew, was shocked to see the harsh treatment of the Palestinians by the Israelis, and the way that on the West Bank, which is Palestinian territory, and even in the areas where the Palestinians are supposed to be completely in control, the Israelis have all the power, and the people have to live with the oppressiveness of this. Just that knowledge, the difficulty of the checkpoints, how difficult that makes their lives. But even, and then of course in the Bedouin villages, they're living in fear of home demolitions. We saw that numerous times, and we stayed in several Bedouin villages. We went to farming villages where the Israelis were cutting off the Palestinians' water supply. And this was Palestinian water.
And otherwise, in places where it's naturally flowing, they're actually building barriers and diverting it into Israeli.
Into the settlements, into the Jewish settlements.
And here's the Palestinians. Well, now there's no water at all.
That's right.
How abundant a crop you think I'll have this time? And olive trees. Some of these families have been on land with the olive trees for 2,000 years, as far as we can tell. It's just been passed on and passed on. And then a bunch of Israeli military people come with armed bulldozers, and they just plow it all under and build something. And if somebody like Rachel Corrie is in the way, they just run right over her. It's a young girl that was run over by a bulldozer with her arms out, trying to prevent the bulldozer from destroying a Palestinian home. They just ran over her. So, I mean, this is the kind of, and it's irony for me because I spend so much time, starting in high school, I'm fascinated by Nazi Germany and also by Stalinist Russia. I've really studied this stuff. Am I an expert? No, I don't think anybody is. But I looked at what the Nazis did. Branding people as evil, using them as scapegoats for all the problems, taking their property without compensation, and ultimately sending them up the smokestacks. And I look at Palestine. Palestine is a country, theoretically, legally it's a country, but it's divided in two with Israel all in the middle because they plowed through that a long time ago. And basically, these two Palestines are in reality open air concentration camps. You try to come in from the ocean, the Israeli Navy will get you, as we saw with the Freedom Flotilla, where they actually murdered, whatever. Some people inadvertently died when they were attacked by Israeli forces on a ship, all announced to the entire world, we're bringing humanitarian supplies, fine for them if somebody wants to inspect us, they won't find any weapons, armor. They kill a bunch of them. And you know, these flotillas continue to be turned back. So, and you can't leave or come into Palestine without the Israeli government's okay. And they basically control, I mean, they need concrete to rebuild. Well, we'll set a quota as, you know, you'll rebuild in 1,000 years. The rate will allow, I mean.
Right, or you need a permit.
Permit.
But nobody is,
so
Palestinians aren't granted permits for the most part.
You're sort of controlling everything. So what they've basically done is turned Palestine from what was once an entire country of Palestine, in which the British and the French got together and decided, oh, well, we've got to make a home for the Jews. And they said, a land without people for a people without land. Well, there were people there, but they just kind of pushed them out of the way. So in the end, I'm left thinking, with the exception of the actual death camps and the production of corpses through crematoria, which, of course, I don't know if you've ever seen the phosphorus bombs being dropped on Gaza and stuff. That's on YouTube, too. They've basically turned Palestine into two open-air concentration camps. You can't come in, you can't go out, you can't receive anything. The only way you can get certain vital materials is to tunnel under the walls. They used to tunnel under the fences to get stuff out of Egypt. Then Egypt decided, well, we like Israel better than Palestine, so, you know, Egypt's kind of cut this behavior off. And I'm thinking, always you see the Holocaust memorials and everything, and I mean, they have huge shrines in Israel. First of all, why didn't they give the people without a land a big chunk of Germany? That would have been a more logical reparation. Not that I want to hurt the poor Germans, they've been through a lot already. But how dare you come out of Europe and other places and basically do to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to you, and then claim that the world owes you a special grace because you suffered so much, and now you turn the suffering on the Palestinians. I'm not very bright. I got a mental defect because you know what? I don't get it. How could the
B-I-B-L-E, that's the book for me. So Joshua goes in and knocks down Jericho and we take it over. Read my buddy's book, Community of Promise, where
how could the
he does.
how could the victims in Act 1 turn into the oppressors in Act 2? I don't get it.
Yeah.
It's
And
a
where
common
are
thing,
we
actually.
now with this? Where
Thomas Jefferson actually quoted that. He said, "Why is it that men, when they overcome their own tyranny through tremendous sweat and toil, then turn around and put others under oppression?" It's a common human phenomenon.
That's how we do it.
But again, it's all based on domination. You know, something that human
Thomas
needs to live with.
Jefferson said things that would scare the hell out of the people in Washington. For example, from time to time, the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of tyrants and patriots alike. A patriot is one who can take the side of the people against the government, but never the other way around. Despite being a slave owner, everything else, you got to read. This was a different time and a different world. People should go back and read the Founding Fathers. They'd be shocked at how radical they actually were, particularly in the milieu that they evolved in.
Well, this is scary.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with the analogy to the Hitler's death camps. Hitler, after all, was
No, that was a
he was
totally
practicing
other
genocide.
magnitude of evil.
Yeah.
I'm
I
not
think it's
I'm
more
not
like
putting
the
them I'm not
apartheid
putting them on a
situation.
par.
And Jimmy Carter said it a long time ago. He said this is more like the situation of apartheid in South Africa, and that's what we saw. People.
Now let me clarify
being
that
forced into enclaves.
the evil of the Third Reich was like the evil of the Pol Pot regime. It was like a psychopathic evil and an entranced population. I mean, so I'm not, but I'm saying there's enough of an analogy to scare you about where this could evolve through time. Because
And
I don't see a resolution in the immediate future. And what I've learned about history is it's like a rubber band.
But
It
I have
stretches
seen-
and stretches and stretches, and then it snaps.
I have seen psychopaths dealt with successfully.
You've what?
And to me, it does come down to this personal level. And it seems so much, too much for every individual to deal with. But you know, where I've seen psychopaths dealt with successfully.
Oh yeah.
But see,
True story. I'll tell you about my combat in
I think the
Vietnam.
Israelis are psychopaths.
I heard this from the guy whose buddy was the one involved. Their patrol, you have guys called point guys. They're in the front, the behind, and out on the sides of the main body, which can be as few as 12 people. And they're supposed to spot the enemy first. What it actually means is they're the poor SOB that gets shot first, so everybody else knows the enemy's right there and gonna deal with it. So he's walking left point, and all of a sudden, just total surprise to both people, there's a Viet Cong with an AK-47. And they're like, what the hell do I do now? And they got their guns pointed at each other, and then the Vietnamese shook his head, no. And the American like, and the Vietnamese pointed to the button on his clip. And he said, and the guy got it. He put the clip for his M16, and they both pushed and released their clips. Now there's still a bullet in the chamber. So then the Vietnamese lifted it, and the American lifted it, and since the Vietnamese was the first to point to the clip, the American jacked his round out of it. Now the commie has still got a bullet in his rifle. He just dropped it, and he's a hero. He pulled his bullet out, and they looked at each other, and they just went, excuse my language on these, it's so appropriate. They both looked at each other. It was like, WTF, this is ridiculous. And they skirted each other and didn't report and they avoided a lot of killing that day.
There it is.
There's a great thing I put on YouTube. It shows this little German Nazi soldier cowering in the pit. He's obviously urinated all over him. He's terrified. And this older soldier's telling him, you gotta go over the top. And I write in my Facebook article, I write little micro articles, mini stories. Why should he want to go over the top? On the top, they're killing each other with everything, in every imaginable way. from bombs to artillery shells to landmines to howitzers to flames to bare hands and knives. He just wants to go home. All soldiers just want to go home.
Right.
If they have to kill anybody, it should be the ones that sent them.
Well, the story that you just told reminds me of one of the most hopeful things that I've read recently. I'm sure you're familiar with this book, On Killing, by Dave Grossman. He spends the first, I really recommend that you read it, Dave.
I haven't.
Have you?
He spends the first part of the book giving empirical evidence that there is actually a resistance to kill in human beings. He goes back and looks at studies of non-shooters in
I've seen the
World War
statistics.
I, World War II. World War II, do you know what the statistics were? Only 85%
Yeah.
of soldiers in combat used their weapons. And it was also a very low percentage in World War I.
No, 20% used their weapons. 20% shot at the enemy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
said just the opposite. 85%
Yeah,
did
there you
not
go.
use
Yeah,
their
yep.
weapons. I'm sorry. And this goes back all the way to the Civil War. After the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, they rounded up 25,000 muskets that were still loaded, that had never been shot. And this isn't just Grossman. I mean, he's drawing on the work of S.L.A. Marshall and others, and to the point where he shows that or says, what else could this be but a resistance to killing, even in soldiers who are ordered to do so? Well, the U.S. government, of course, got this information, the military, and so they changed the
We
methods.
take the best and the brightest, our most educated, our psychiatrists, psychologists, social engineers, and fix it.
That's right, exactly. So now soldiers in boot camp are trained to kill, really to become killing machines through sophisticated methods of operant conditioning. And so the percentage of non-killers in Korea and Vietnam went way down. In Vietnam, maybe 95% of the soldiers actually used their weapons to kill. And then you can understand why there's such a terrific, this is another factor anyway, in the terrific incidence of PTSD on the part of Vietnam veterans.
And there are a couple of facts that are part of the training there too, which is that the sergeants used to train us online. You know this a lot better than I do, but they were some of the gentlest people. They didn't want to kill anybody.
I'd love to get a book on military euphemisms. My favorite is, you do not shoot a projectile at 2,800 feet per second that makes a small hole in front of somebody and rips a hole as big as a grapefruit out the back of them, and everything in there goes flying out as a splatter. Some beautiful child of a loving mother and father, the sister and brother, the ones at home.
Yeah.
You killed so-and-so. It's like in All Quiet on the Western Front, I have killed Danielle the baker. You know, he's like, he realizes what he's done. And no, you don't splatter the guy. You don't waste him. You service the target.
Service the
You
target.
service the target.
And you have a sergeant standing over your shoulder.
Oh my God.
The sergeant says, rattles the guy's cage. Fire, 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 fire. No, 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 no. And the other thing is this wonderful debate we have over automatic weapons. I think Dave and I could probably argue over that.
Semi-automatic weapons. There's a big difference.
And you would not want a person with a semi-automatic weapon to be your hitman because they aren't that accurate. They spray the bullets.
No, machine gun spray bullets. Generally, they rise up and to the right. I fired a number of different machine guns in the military, and
But you want a marksman.
what?
For a hitman, you want a marksman.
Yeah.
I qualified as expert. Top,
Well, I know
top
you
7%. But the point of it is the machine gun is spray and pray. It's fill the air with lead. That alone will deter somebody from actually getting out of the cover and attacking you. But to actually hit the target, you want one of those old-fashioned World War I or World War II rifles, shooting one shot at a time, actually seeing what you're shooting at, adjusting for windage and elevation, and you can hit the target.
You should have brought one in.
Anyway.
Laurie, if you want some illustration, just call on Dave. He'll bring in his Armada.
Well, we saw plenty of soldiers wielding weapons in the West Bank. Everywhere we went, there were
What
soldiers.
kind of behavior
And
did you see?
civilians, and civilians in Israel, many of them, especially out on the kibbutzes and the
settlers.
the places they've taken over. What do they call them? The places they've taken over and occupied on Palestinian land.
The settlements,
The settlements.
Jewish
The settlements,
settlements.
You'll see all kinds of civilians, or not all, but many of them. They're in possession of machine guns and more ammunition than you could buy with your life savings.
And the government has F-35.
I actually saw outside the tomb of Abraham in Hebron one evening. We
Yeah.
were on patrol, just looking out for trouble, and I saw two young men come out of a Jewish settlement
Yeah.
with
Explain
a
about
weapon
the
the size
tomb
of
too.
an M4.
How there's the Christian side and the Jewish side and the Islamic side.
Yeah, Hebron is the one place where the settlements are actually built on top of Palestinian homes and so forth. So unlike settlements that are out in the countryside
They
with
throw the
barriers
garbage
around
down.
them,
Yes.
they built right on top. They're right next to Palestinians who have to live with this.
It's amazing.
But these two settler young men, looked like they were maybe late teens or 20s, went out to jog. They actually were in just shorts and T-shirts. But they each carried, I didn't get a close look at the weapon, but it was at least the size of an
Galil,
M4,
whatever.
a large automatic weapon. And I don't know if it was automatic or semi-automatic, it's just a matter of how it's rigged.
Over there, they'll all be selected.
But I wanted to try to catch up with them and say, hey, that's pretty cool, what are you doing with that? But it was so clear that they were just demonstrating that young male
Don't mess with us, that's all.
machismo. And of course, no Palestinian is allowed to have anything that even closely resembles a weapon. So imagine being an equally undeveloped young man and having to put up with this other peer of yours, just knowing he can shoot you with impunity anytime he wants. Tough situation. The good news is that what we're talking about here, this human resistance to killing, I saw that in action. We got to talk to Israeli soldiers in a couple of situations, particularly at the border around Gaza. And if you could get them by themselves, at least the few that we talked to, one young man, I said, this is really stupid, isn't it? And he goes, yeah. He says, I just want to be in college. And then numerous young Israeli soldiers, they don't want to be there. They don't want to be told to go in a place where everybody hates them and do things that they wouldn't want done to themselves. They know that intuitively. And their training has to overcome that and their cultural expectations. But on the other side, we met these young people from all over the world that come and work with the International Solidarity Movement. These are more unruly kids that are just tired of injustice and they've heard they can do something about it there, and they go in. And they're willing to put their lives on the line in the same way. So equally young people.
Yeah.
If you give them a chance to use nonviolence, they're just as happy doing it. And this is, I think, a tremendous thing. The cultural belief is that violence is what's required to really handle bad guys. There's no science for that at all. In fact, the science we're slowly accumulating suggests that actually nonviolence is likely to keep you safer. And these ISM people demonstrate it. And that the two most hopeful thing is I've been following Christian peacemaker teams and meta-peace teams now for 25, 30 years. And these were new concepts. I can remember brainstorming with the leaders of these things before they existed. But I met two young people separately in Palestine that said they wanted to grow up being part of an unarmed peace team. So when I give lectures on the power of nonviolence, as I call it, I'll usually ask a group of people, if we paid your college education and gave you an interesting job for 4 years, but you had to go unarmed into dangerous conflict like I've talked about today, how many would do it? And most of them will raise their hand. And I saw them actually doing it over
Right.
there.
Right.
Yeah.
The most striking example has actually occurred since we came back, but we're still in touch with members of the International Solidarity Movement, these unruly kids who become very quickly effective human rights activists. They go
Because
out.
they're mentored by Palestinian
Right.
people that are used to
Right.
working with them.
And so one young woman was part of a small group that was present at a clash.
Now, what is a clash?
A clash is something that occurs once a week in numerous Palestinian towns in the West Bank. The Israeli soldiers, it usually occurs after prayers, Friday afternoon after prayers. The Israeli soldiers who are there make their presence known. They kind of come out in full force. They just manifest, whether it's on the top of a building or right by a checkpoint. And on the other hand, the young people, many young people in the village, the Shabab, start collecting stones and throwing stones. And these clashes can go on for hours. And I have to say, I was somewhat frightened by the first one because it's very intense. Not only, I mean, the Shabab, you know, just kind of, they throw the stones hard. I wasn't afraid of them hurting anyone. But in response, the Israelis used stun grenades and tear gas. I got my first big whiff of tear gas.
Welcome to the club.
And I know. And rubber bullets and sometimes live ammunition, very rarely live ammunition. These clashes go on for hours, and we attended several and videotaped them, just let our presence be known. We like to think that since we were there, the soldiers were more reticent than they would have been otherwise to actually hurt the Palestinians, though we
or inadvertently hurt you.
But shortly after we got back, we heard from one of our friends who was, as I say, in this international solidarity movement. She's a young woman from Norway who went to a clash and she thought the clash was over, and so she was accompanying this man back to his car, and the soldiers kept yelling at her, saying, "You're causing all this trouble." And these ISM kids just aren't intimidated by the soldiers, and she just called back, "No, you're the one with the guns, you're the one with the weapons, you're causing the trouble." And they shot her. They shot her it was a rubber bullet. I mean, she was videotaping
They can be
it.
lethal, though. Rubber bullets can kill or do serious damage.
Well, she was videotaping it, and the last scene was her abdomen having been penetrated by this bullet. And she had to be taken to the hospital. And she said what she was really worried about, though, was the Palestinian kid behind her who she'd heard gotten hit in the head. Okay, but this is how tough she is. So she sends it out on Facebook, and we're all supporting her. And then the next week, they have another clash. It's Friday afternoon. She goes back, and she said, "I had to go back and show them I wasn't afraid." But this time, they targeted her immediately, and she got shot again. Can you believe it? These kids are fierce. I don't know. I wasn't willing to be shot. When they started bringing out those rubber bullets, I kind of went to the side, I have to say. So, but here, this woman is just so passionately supportive of the Palestinians that she's willing to do this. She overcomes these just really basic fears that we have of getting hurt.
Yeah.
I never got over any basic fear of getting hurt. I'm afraid of getting hurt. I'm not afraid of death, but I'm terrified of pain. I've seen too much of it already. You'd be exactly the same.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot more than I have. You know what
we
it
were
is.
in a lot of dicey situations, but the only time I was afraid was when we were surprised by soldiers coming down the alley just 2 weeks before this woman got shot, coming the same way. And when these guys got into position, started firing, and I heard things going by me, I didn't know it was live ammunition or a rubber bullet. Really is a steel bullet that's coated with rubber, and it can kill. It certainly hits in the eye
It
or
hits
the
you in
head.
the right place.
It would kill you.
Right in your brain, the eye temple,
Yeah.
crush your larynx.
But the hope for me is realizing that what she did was much more natural to human beings. She didn't require months of brainwashing and conditioning to do something that was against her nature. She did what came naturally. Now, for some people, that bravery is natural.
It took an incredible amount of courage, intestinal fortitude for her to stand in the shadow of her beliefs.
Yes, but the amount of courage probably isn't related to it. You probably find, I'm sure you know, some of your soldiers were very courageous in going out there, and other ones really were hanging back. That's the spectrum of any normal human differences. But what's different with what she did, and when I saw these other guys, these guys would run up to the Israeli bulldozer and chain themselves so they wouldn't demolish a house, and the Israeli forces just rip them and hit them and beat them and drag them off to prison. They're willing to do that, and they do it without a lot of training. Imagine if we trained large numbers of people to do this kind of thing. We wouldn't need war anymore. Because when you use violence, you always sow the seeds of next violence. When you end an injustice with nonviolence, it doesn't sow those same seeds. It sows just the opposite. You still see the courage. You still see what we admire in the military, the courage, the self-sacrifice, the hard work. That's what we admire. It's not the killing. Let's just take the killing out of it. And to me, the only difference is what I call leveling the playing field between war and peace, is if we took all of the sacrifice we make for violence, the training, the money to train, the military equipment, the long years, the money we spend on weapons, and put it into training people to do what these kids demonstrate naturally comes to human beings, I think it would be a profound change.
When you look at the fact that the United States spends more money on all things military than the entire rest of the world put together. I mean, you look at the percentage of the budgets of, like take China and Russia, the two other big players in the full spectrum military world, and their military budgets are huge. I mean, it's billions of dollars. They're making tanks, planes, and missiles and rifles. But when you compare it to what we spend, oh my gosh, we're outspending every other country in the world. I had this vision.
Most of whom are our allies, by the way.
Yeah. What if a tidal wave hit Bangladesh? And with the seas rising the way they are, it's going to happen.
Very possible.
And all of a sudden, there was a full spectrum attack by the United States military. Our bombers went in and dropped food and safe water. Our Marines crashed onto the shore and started fixing the infrastructure, getting those wires back up.
Yep.
Our docs and medics started going out and looking for the wounded and rescuing them. And we did this around the world for half what we spend on the military.
Much less than half.
We would be the most beloved country in the history of the world. And in our hearts, isn't this what we really want?
That's
your
my vision.
vision.
That's my vision.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Dave, you've got to take all this energy that young people have and
Focus it.
give them something else to do that's energetic and risky and things that young brains like to do. And they're more than willing to do it. All you have to do is pay them to do it.
Snowboard?
We actually have one of the people that was on our show. You remember the Jamaica bobsled team?
Yes.
Okay, this guy's the same
Cool
thing.
runnings.
Palestinian skateboard team, a guy named Silawa. And he basically is working to educate and create educational forums. And he's a PhD and very well spoken and very bright and I think in what I call intelligently focused. I know a lot of bright people that are like, So, but he is working to personally create venues and help establish venues to create the next generation of Palestinian leadership. And one of his pet projects, and we raised some money for it, is Palestinian skateboard team, because he says skateboarding will be the next Olympic sport, and we want to be there.
I can see that. I can see that.
Well, now we've raised today
Did the
the
1 minute?
questions of
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up
To
because
wrap
we're
up,
down. We're down to a few
Okay.
seconds. Gosh, it was so great having you guys on the
Great.
show.
Come
Thank
again, I got a
you.
lot more
I hope
questions.
to have you on
Anytime.
the show again as a
We have a lot to talk about.
as a pair.
Where do we go from
I'll
here?
tell you what, a few shows from now, why don't we get you guys back? You'll have had a little more time to digest this experience. I know because
Change
Dave
your
and I
diet?
chimed in on a few things. We've always tried to do this show as sort of like just as a conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of other experiences, and as it settles in, deeper and newer perspectives that are going to come out of this. And I think we'd like to bring that to our audience.
And what you're touching when you come home, how you see what are the live options for you as you return here. And get
We're
back
out of
to
time.
We're out of time.
So thank you so much for being our
Thanks
guest.
for having us, Dave.
Thank you for
Oh,
tuning in and watching
great.
Veterans for Peace.
Amen.
That's why I take it over, because I
You
know
came in all the way from Waterville?